September 1944. The Netherlands is starving. 20,000 Dutch civilians will die of hunger in the coming winter. Nazi occupation has crushed the nation for 4 brutal years, and Allied forces are bogged down across Europe. But thousands of kilometers away, a country with no colonial ties, no strategic debt, and no obligation to the Dutch is about to sacrifice 7,600 of its young men to set them free. And 80 years later, elderly Dutch citizens still kneel at their graves, leaving flowers for soldiers they never met. Why would a nation on the other side of the Atlantic give so much for a country they owed nothing to? And why do the Dutch still refuse to let the world forget it? To understand this bond, we need to go back to the darkest days of the war, back to a small European country crushed under the Nazi boot, back to a moment when hope itself seemed to be dying. May 1940, the German war machine rolled into the Netherlands with terrifying speed. The Dutch army fought back, but they never stood a chance. In just 5 days, it was over. German bombers had flattened the heart of Rotterdam, killing nearly 1,100 people and leaving 85,000 homeless in a single afternoon. The message was clear: resist, and your cities will burn. The Dutch royal family had no choice. Queen Wilhelmina, her daughter Princess Juliana, and the young princesses fled in the night. They boarded a British destroyer as German troops closed in. The Queen would end up in London. But Princess Juliana and her 2 little daughters needed somewhere safer, somewhere far from the bombs. They chose Canada. This small decision would plant the first seed of a bond that would last generations. But nobody knew that yet. In 1940, Canada was just a safe place to hide, a friendly nation across the ocean where a princess could raise her children in peace while her homeland suffered. And suffer it did. The Nazi occupation turned the Netherlands into a prison. German soldiers patrolled every street. Secret police watched every corner. Dutch Jews were rounded up and sent east to death camps. Of the 140,000 Jews living in the Netherlands before the war, more than 100,000 would never come home. Entire families vanished. Neighbors disappeared in the night. Children were torn from their parents' arms. The Dutch resistance fought back in small ways. They hid Jewish families in attics and basements. They printed illegal newspapers. They sabotaged German equipment when they could. But the punishment for resistance was death. The Nazis executed thousands of Dutch civilians as a warning to others. By 1944, the situation grew even more desperate. The Allies had landed in France on D-Day, June 6th. Hope flickered across occupied Europe. The war was finally turning. Liberation seemed close. In September, Allied forces launched Operation Market Garden, a bold plan to capture bridges in the Netherlands and push straight into Germany. If it worked, the war might be over by Christmas. It did not work. The operation failed at Arnhem, where British paratroopers were surrounded and crushed. The Allies had pushed into the southern Netherlands, but the north remained under Nazi control, and the Germans were furious. They decided to punish the Dutch for supporting the Allied attack. The punishment was starvation. The Germans cut off food supplies to the western Netherlands. They blocked roads. They stopped trains. They flooded farmland by destroying dikes. 4.5 million Dutch people were trapped in cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, with almost nothing to eat. What followed was the Hunger Winter, the coldest, cruelest months the Netherlands had ever known. By November 1944, the official food ration had dropped to just 1,000 calories per day. By February 1945, it fell to 500 calories. A grown man needs at least 2,000 calories just to survive. People were slowly starving to death in their own homes. The cities ran out of food first. Bread disappeared, then potatoes, Then vegetables. People ate tulip bulbs, which taste bitter and make you sick, but have just enough nutrition to keep you alive another day. They ate sugar beets meant for animals. They boiled grass and weeds into soup. They stripped bark from trees and ground it into flour. The winter of 1944 was brutally cold. Temperatures dropped well below freezing for weeks at a time. But there was no fuel. The Germans had taken the coal. People burned their furniture to stay warm. They tore apart their own homes, ripping out floorboards and door frames to feed their stoves. Families huddled together in single rooms, wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching their breath turn to fog in the frozen air. The weakest died first. Babies, the elderly, the sick. Bodies piled up in hospitals and morgues. There was no wood left to build coffins. There was no fuel to dig graves in the frozen ground. Families wrapped their dead in sheets and left them in churches, waiting for spring. By the time the hunger winter ended, between 18,000 and 22,000 Dutch civilians had starved to death. Thousands more would die in the months that followed from diseases their weakened bodies could not fight. This was the Netherlands in early 1945, a broken nation, a starving people, a country that had lost all hope. And then the Canadians came. Canada had entered the war in September 1939, just 1 week after Britain. It was a young country, barely 70 years old. It had no empire. It had no colonies. It had no military tradition like Britain or France. Before the war, Canada's entire army had fewer than 5,000 soldiers. But Canada grew into something extraordinary. By 1945, more than 1 million Canadians had served in the armed forces. For a country of just 11 million people, this was a stunning sacrifice. Nearly 1 in 10 Canadians put on a uniform. These soldiers came from wheat farms in Saskatchewan, from fishing villages in Nova Scotia, from logging camps in British Columbia, from the frozen north and the bustling cities. They were not professional soldiers. They were factory workers and students and farmers who had never fired a gun before the war. They had already fought across Italy, pushing slowly up the peninsula through mud and mountains. They had landed on Juno Beach on D-Day and fought their way through France. They had seen friends die in their arms. They had learned what war really meant. Now they were given a new mission: liberate the Netherlands. The task was almost impossible. The Germans had flooded vast areas of Dutch farmland by opening the dikes. Entire regions lay under meters of cold gray water. The roads that remained were narrow and easily defended. The Germans had dug in deep, building concrete bunkers and laying thousands of mines. They knew the war was lost, but they would make the Allies pay for every kilometer. The Canadian commanders looked at their maps. They counted their men. They studied the flooded fields and fortified towns. They knew what was coming. Many of their soldiers would not survive this campaign. But somewhere in the Netherlands, millions of people were starving. Children were dying. Families were burning their homes to stay warm. Every day of delay meant more death. The Canadians moved forward. The liberation of the Netherlands would become one of the most brutal campaigns Canadian soldiers ever faced. It would cost them dearly. But they pushed forward anyway, through flooded fields and fortified towns, because millions of lives depended on them. The first major obstacle was the Scheldt estuary. This was the water passage leading to the vital port of Antwerp in Belgium. The Allies had captured Antwerp in September 1944, but they could not use it. German forces still controlled both banks of the Scheldt, and they had planted thousands of mines in the water. Until the Scheldt was cleared, no supply ships could reach the port. And without supplies, the Allied advance would grind to a halt. The job fell to the 1st Canadian Army. In October 1944, they began the Battle of the Scheldt. It would be 5 weeks of pure misery. The landscape was a nightmare. The Germans had flooded the polders, the low-lying farmland that the Dutch had reclaimed from the sea over centuries. Canadian soldiers waded through chest-deep water that was freezing cold and thick with mud. They carried their rifles above their heads to keep them dry. Their boots filled with water and stayed wet for days. Their feet turned white and swollen with trench foot, a painful condition that could cripple a man. The October rain never seemed to stop. It fell in sheets, turning every path into a river of mud. Tanks and trucks sank up to their axles and had to be abandoned. Soldiers crawled on their bellies through flooded fields, pushing their equipment ahead of them on small rafts. The mud sucked at their legs with every step, draining their strength before they even reached the enemy. And the enemy was waiting. German troops had turned every farmhouse into a fortress. They had concrete bunkers with machine guns that could sweep across the flat, open land. They had artillery zeroed in on every approach. They had snipers hidden in church towers and windmills, and they had orders to hold their positions to the last man. The Canadians attacked anyway. They stormed across flooded fields under heavy fire. They cleared towns house by house, kicking in doors and fighting room by room. They used flamethrowers to burn out bunkers that would not surrender. They called in aircraft to bomb positions they could not reach on foot. The fighting at the Scheldt cost the 1st Canadian Army 12,973 casualties in just 5 weeks. Nearly 13,000 young men killed, wounded, or missing. The water in the flooded fields turned red with blood. Medics worked around the clock, pulling wounded soldiers from the mud and loading them onto boats. Field hospitals overflowed with broken bodies. But the Canadians did not stop. By November 8, 1944, the Scheldt was clear. The first supply ship sailed into Antwerp. The Allied war machine could move again. The liberation of the Netherlands proper began in early 1945. The Canadians pushed east and north, fighting through one fortified town after another. Every village had to be taken by force. Every crossroads was defended. The Germans laid mines on every road and booby-trapped every building they abandoned. The casualties mounted with terrible speed. In the Rhineland offensive in February and March 1945, Canadian forces suffered another 15,000 casualties. Young men who had survived Italy and France and the Scheldt finally met their end in the flat, gray fields of the Netherlands. Letters went home to mothers and fathers across Canada, telling them their sons would not be coming back. But something remarkable was happening too. As the Canadians liberated each town, the Dutch people came out to meet them. After 5 years of Nazi occupation, after months of starvation, they poured into the streets to welcome their liberators. Old women wept and kissed the hands of Canadian soldiers. Children ran alongside the tanks and jeeps, laughing and cheering. Young women threw flowers and offered kisses to the blushing young men who had come to save them. Dutch families brought out whatever food they had hidden from the Germans and shared it with their liberators. It was not much. A piece of bread. A cup of milk, a precious egg. But they gave it gladly. The Canadian soldiers were shocked by what they found. They had seen poverty and destruction across Europe, but nothing had prepared them for the hunger winter. The Dutch civilians looked like walking skeletons. Their clothes hung loose on their shrunken bodies. Their eyes seemed too large for their thin faces. Children had swollen bellies from malnutrition. Old people could barely stand. The soldiers did what soldiers are not supposed to do. They gave away their rations. They handed out chocolate bars and cans of meat and packets of biscuits. They emptied their pockets for children who had not tasted real food in months. Officers looked the other way. Everyone understood that these people needed help more than regulations needed following. In the city of Apeldoorn, liberated in April 1945, Canadian tanks rolled down streets lined with thousands of cheering Dutch citizens. Orange flags appeared everywhere, the color of the Dutch royal family. People who had hidden those flags for 5 years, risking death if the Germans found them, now waved them proudly in the spring sunshine. In Hilversum, a Canadian soldier shared his lunch with a group of hungry children. One little girl, so weak she could barely walk, looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. She did not speak English. He did not speak Dutch, but no words were needed. He picked her up and carried her to a field kitchen where cooks were making hot soup for the civilians. That image, a strong young soldier carrying a starving child, captured something true about what the liberation meant. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away, in Ottawa, another part of this story was unfolding. Princess Juliana had been living in Canada since 1940. She had found safety and friendship in a country that expected nothing in return. Canadians had welcomed her family with open arms. They had guarded her children. They had given her a home when her homeland was in chains. In January 1943, while the war still raged, Princess Juliana gave birth to her third daughter in an Ottawa hospital. The Canadian government did something extraordinary. They declared the hospital room to be temporarily outside of Canadian territory. This meant the baby princess was born on Dutch soil, even though she was in Canada. It was a gesture of pure kindness, a small country's gift to a suffering nation. The baby was named Margret, after the daisy flower that had become a symbol of Dutch resistance. When news of her birth reached the occupied Netherlands, people wept with joy. A new princess had been born. The royal line continued. Hope lived on. By late April 1945, Canadian forces had liberated most of the Netherlands, but the western cities, Amsterdam and Rotterdam and The Hague, remained under German control. Millions of people were still starving. The war in Europe was clearly ending, but every day of fighting meant more deaths from hunger. Then, on April 28th, the guns fell silent. A temporary truce was called. And Operation Manna began. Allied bombers that had spent years destroying German cities now flew low over Dutch cities on a mission of mercy. They dropped not bombs, but food. Crates of bread and flour and chocolate tumbled from the sky. Dutch civilians ran into the streets, looking up at the planes with tears in their eyes. On the rooftops, people had painted 2 words in giant letters: "Thank you." The full liberation came days later. On May 5th, 1945, German forces in the Netherlands surrendered to the Canadian Army. The war was over. The Netherlands was free, but freedom had come at a terrible cost. More than 7,600 Canadian soldiers had died to liberate the Netherlands. Thousands more were wounded. These were young men in their 20s, most of them, boys from farms and cities across Canada who had crossed an ocean to fight for people they had never met. The Dutch would never forget what they had sacrificed. May 5th, 1945. The moment the Dutch had dreamed about for 5 long years finally arrived. German General Johannes Blaskowitz signed the surrender documents in the Dutch town of Wageningen. Canadian General Charles Foulkes accepted the surrender on behalf of the Allied forces. The war in the Netherlands was over. What happened next was an explosion of pure joy. Church bells that had been silent for years suddenly rang out across the country. The Germans had stolen most of the bells, melted them down for metal to make weapons. But the bells that remained now sang out the news of freedom. The sound echoed across cities and villages, across canals and farmland, telling everyone that the nightmare was finally over. People poured into the streets by the hundreds of thousands. They came out of their homes, out of their hiding places, out of the shadows where they had lived for 5 years. They laughed and cried and hugged strangers. They danced in town squares to music they had not been allowed to play. They sang songs that had been forbidden under the occupation. The color orange exploded everywhere. Orange flags flew from every window. Orange ribbons appeared in hair and on clothing. Orange flowers filled the hands of children. The color of the royal family, banned by the Nazis, now covered the nation like a sunrise after the longest night. And in the middle of it all were the Canadians. Dutch civilians mobbed the Canadian soldiers with a gratitude that overwhelmed them. Young women kissed every soldier they could reach. Old men shook their hands and would not let go, tears streaming down weathered faces. Children climbed onto tanks and jeeps, laughing and waving tiny flags. Families brought out hidden bottles of wine and liquor they had buried in gardens or walled up in cellars, saving them for this exact moment. One Canadian soldier later wrote home about that day. He described how an elderly Dutch woman grabbed his hand and pressed it to her cheek. She kept saying the same words over and over in broken English. Thank you, thank you, thank you. He said he had never felt anything like it in his life. He had seen terrible things in the war. He had lost friends. He had wondered if any of it mattered. In that moment, holding that old woman's hand, he knew it had all been worth it. The contrast between occupation and liberation could not have been sharper. Just days before, German soldiers had patrolled these same streets with rifles. Dutch citizens had walked with their eyes down, afraid to attract attention. Speaking out meant arrest. Helping a neighbor could mean death. The whole country had lived in fear. Now the fear was gone. People walked tall for the first time in years. They looked each other in the eye. They spoke freely. They breathed freely. Freedom, after you have lost it, is the sweetest thing in the world. But the celebrations could not hide the scars. The liberation revealed the full horror of what the Dutch had suffered. Canadian soldiers walked through cities where buildings stood empty, their Jewish residents taken to the death camps. They saw mass graves that had to be dug for the victims of the hunger winter. They met children who had been orphaned, parents who had lost everyone, families torn apart by war and occupation. The numbers told a grim story. More than 200,000 Dutch civilians had died during the occupation. Over 100,000 of them were Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Another 20,000 had starved during the hunger winter. Thousands more had been executed by the Nazis for resistance activities. The Netherlands, a small country of just 9 million people, had lost more than 2% of its entire population. Canadian forces had paid their own terrible price. Of the 175,000 Canadian soldiers who fought to liberate the Netherlands, more than 7,600 never went home. They died in the flooded fields of the Scheldt. They fell in the house-to-house fighting in fortified towns. They were killed by snipers and mines and artillery in the final weeks of a war that was already lost for Germany. These young men were buried where they fell. Their graves now dot the Dutch countryside, marked by simple white headstones in military cemeteries. The largest is Groesbeek Canadian War Cemetery, where 2,619 Canadian soldiers rest. Holten Canadian War Cemetery holds another, 1,294. Bergen op Zoom has 118 more. The Dutch made a promise to these fallen soldiers. They would never be forgotten. They would never be alone. In the weeks after liberation, Dutch families began visiting the Canadian graves. They brought flowers. They brought small flags. They stood in silence before the headstones, reading the names of boys who had died so far from home. Many of these families had never met the soldiers they mourned, but they came anyway. They felt they owed a debt that could never be repaid. As the summer of 1945 turned to fall, the surviving Canadian soldiers began shipping home. They left behind a country that loved them. They left behind graves of friends who would stay forever. They left behind memories of horror and heroism that would shape the rest of their lives. The Dutch watched them go with heavy hearts. How do you thank someone for giving you back your freedom? How do you thank someone for dying so that you could live? Words seemed too small, gestures seemed too weak, but the Dutch found a way. In the fall of 1945, the Dutch royal family sent a gift to Canada. It was 100,000 tulip bulbs. Just flowers, simple and beautiful. A small token of thanks for a debt that could never be measured. That first shipment of tulips was only the beginning. The Dutch had decided that their gratitude would not be a single moment. It would be a promise, a tradition, a bond that would last as long as memory itself. The tulips arrived in Ottawa in the fall of 1945. 100,000 bulbs, packed carefully in crates and shipped across the Atlantic. They were planted around the Canadian capital, and when spring came, they bloomed in brilliant reds and yellows and oranges. A splash of color to mark the end of darkness. A gift from a grateful nation to the country that had saved it. But the Dutch did not stop there. The next year, another shipment arrived, and the year after that, and every single year since 1945, the Netherlands has sent tulips to Canada. What began as a simple thank you has become one of the longest-running traditions of gratitude in the world. Today, more than 80 years later, the Dutch still send 20,000 tulip bulbs to Canada every single year. The Canadian Tulip Festival in Ottawa has grown into the largest tulip festival in the world. Every May, more than 1 million tulips bloom across the capital. Visitors come from around the globe to walk among the flowers. But Canadians know what those tulips really mean. They are not just flowers. They are a promise kept, a memory preserved, a thank you that never ends. The tulips are beautiful. But the most powerful symbol of this bond lies not in Canada. It lies in the quiet corners of the Dutch countryside, where Canadian soldiers sleep forever beneath white stone markers. There are more than 7,600 Canadian graves in the Netherlands. They are spread across several military cemeteries, each one perfectly maintained. The grass is always trimmed. The headstones are always clean. The flowers are always fresh. This did not happen by accident. It happened because the Dutch people made it their mission to honor these fallen soldiers as if they were their own sons. After the war, Dutch families began adopting Canadian graves. They did not do this because anyone asked them to. They did it because they felt they had to. A family would choose a grave, learn the soldier's name, and take responsibility for caring for that small plot of earth. They would visit regularly, bringing flowers and flags. They would stand in silence, paying respect to a young man who had died so they could be free. This tradition has passed down through generations. Grandparents who remembered the liberation taught their children to care for the graves. Those children taught their own children. Today, there are Dutch families who have tended the same Canadian grave for 80 years, 3 or 4 generations of one family honoring one soldier who died before any of them were born. At Holton Canadian War Cemetery, every single one of the 1,394 graves has been adopted by a Dutch family. On Liberation Day each year, thousands of people gather at the cemetery. School children place flowers on every headstone. Veterans and dignitaries give speeches. But it is the ordinary Dutch citizens who make the ceremony meaningful. Elderly men and women stand before graves they have visited for decades. Young parents bring children to see the soldier their family has adopted. The names on the headstones belong to strangers, but they are treated like family. Every year on May 4th, the Netherlands observes its National Remembrance Day. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the entire country falls silent. Trains stop on their tracks. Cars pull over to the side of the road. People stand still wherever they are, heads bowed for 2 full minutes. They remember all who died in the war, but they especially remember the Canadians who came from so far away to set them free. The next day, May 5th, is Liberation Day. It is a national holiday in the Netherlands. There are parades and concerts and festivals across the country. But the celebrations always include Canadian veterans. For decades, Dutch cities have invited Canadian soldiers back to march in the parades. They are treated like heroes. They are thanked in the streets by people who were children when the war ended. Each year, there are fewer veterans left. The young men who stormed the beaches and cleared the Scheldt and liberated the starving cities are now in their late 90s or past 100 years old. When they visit the Netherlands, crowds still gather to see them. People still reach out to shake their hands. Children still bring them flowers. The gratitude has not faded with time. If anything, it has grown stronger. In 2019, a 93-year-old Canadian veteran returned to the Netherlands for the 75th anniversary of the liberation. As he walked through the streets of a town he had helped free 3/4 of a century ago, he was surrounded by Dutch citizens who wanted to thank him. A little girl, perhaps 7 years old, walked up to him with a small bouquet of flowers. She did not speak English. He did not speak Dutch. But she looked up at him with tears in her eyes, the same tears that her great-grandmother might have shed in 1945, and said the only words she needed to say: "Thank you." The bond between Canada and the Netherlands has become part of both nations' identities. Dutch people grow up learning about the Canadians who saved them. Canadian children learn about the liberation in school. The two countries have a special relationship that goes beyond politics or trade or military alliances. It is personal. It is emotional. It is passed down from parents to children like a family story. Princess Margriet, the baby born in Ottawa in 1943, has spent her entire life honoring this connection. She has visited Canada many times. She has attended ceremonies at war cemeteries. She has thanked Canadian veterans personally. She is a living symbol of what Canada did for the Netherlands, a princess who exists because a young country opened its arms to a royal family in exile. But Princess Margriet was not the only Dutch person to build a life in Canada because of the war. In the months after liberation, something unexpected happened. Young Canadian soldiers and Dutch women fell in love. They had met in the chaos of war, in liberated towns and celebration dances, in moments of joy after years of darkness. When the soldiers shipped home, nearly 2,000 Dutch women went with them as war brides. They crossed the Atlantic to start new lives in a country they had never seen, marrying the men who had freed their homeland. Their children and grandchildren live in Canada today, carrying both nations in their blood. The liberation did not just create gratitude between two countries, it created families. But why does this bond endure when so many wartime connections have faded? Why do the Dutch still send tulips after 80 years? Why do families still tend the graves of soldiers they never met? Perhaps it is because the Dutch understand something that others forget. Freedom is not free, it is bought with blood and sacrifice. And when someone gives their life so that you can live, you do not forget. You cannot forget. The Canadian soldiers who died in the Netherlands were not fighting for land or wealth or power. They were fighting for people they had never met. They crossed an ocean and gave their lives so that strangers could be free. That kind of sacrifice demands to be remembered. It demands to be honored. It demands to be passed down through generations. The tulips that bloom in Ottawa each spring are not just flowers. They are a message from the Dutch people to the Canadian people. A message that says we remember. We will always remember. As long as there is a Netherlands, we will remember what you did for us. And in the quiet cemeteries scattered across the Dutch countryside, where more than 7,600 Canadian soldiers rest beneath white headstones, Dutch families still come to lay flowers. They come in sunshine and in rain. They come in spring and in winter. They come alone, and with their children, and with their grandchildren. They come because some debts can never be repaid. They can only be honored, and the Dutch have chosen to honor this debt forever.